On June 26, the G7 Summit Week kicked off in Germany, where G7 leaders formally launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII, pledging to raise $600 billion in private and public funds to finance infrastructure needed in developing countries to counter the One Belt, One Road by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. We have observed a series of somewhat unusual phenomena since April 2022. While the Russian-Ukraine war remains the current focus of the world, U.S. and European leaders have also launched a diplomatic offensive in Asia, making frequent trips to the Indo-Pacific region to strategize about the region from an economic to a security perspective, which has resulted that Red China faces its worst isolation in the world in more than 30 years. The infrastructure project was proposed by G7 leaders at last year's summit due to growing concerns about the Chinese Communist challenge, but is now officially launched under a new name, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII, ditching the concept of a Build Back Better World initiative previously proposed by Biden.
Today we officially launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. We collectively have dozens of projects already underway around the globe. And I'm proud to announce the United States will mobilize $200 billion in public and private capital over the next 5 years for that partnership.
Team Europe is mobilizing 300 billion euros till 2027 over the next 7 years from both public and private sources. 300 billion euros for sustainable, quality infrastructure and also for health infrastructure. Investments that are transparent and that improve everyday lives and bring real benefit for the communities on the ground.
White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said Biden and other leaders will announce the first group of projects. The U.S. considers them as an alternative to those infrastructure projects sold to low- and middle-income countries for debt trap purposes. Beijing's similar Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Xi Jinping in 2013, provides financing to more than 100 countries, with projects ranging from railroads to ports and highways. The U.S. has long denounced the Communist Party's Belt and Road infrastructure projects as an attempt to set up debt traps for partner countries and make them economically dependent on the CCP. With the launch of PGII, the U.S. will focus on several flagship projects, including a $2 billion solar development project in Angola with support from the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, U.S. firm Africa Global Schaefer, and U.S. project developer Sun Africa. Washington will also join G7 members and the European Union in providing $3.3 million in technical assistance to the Institut Pasteur de Dakar in Senegal as it develops an industrial-scale multi-vaccine production facility in the country that could eventually produce COVID-19 and other vaccines. Europe has long treated the CCP in a very friendly manner, but that is now changing as well, and there is an uncontested consensus among the European countries to reduce their economic dependence on China. The British Prime Minister, who was in Germany for the G7 summit, said it was necessary to find a balance between protecting common Western values and doing business with China. Earlier, the EU announced the creation of the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, or TTC, and the EU also restarted free trade talks with India, with the vision that India could replace China in the future as a major source of supply chains for Europe. Both the European Commission President and the German Chancellor, during their trips to Asia, have made it clear that they want to see close relations with countries that share common values in the Asia-Pacific region, with the obvious implication of hammering Beijing. Europe has come to intervene in the Taiwan issue, which received little attention before. On April 30th, the Financial Times quoted sources as saying that the U.S. and Britain held their first high-level meeting on the Taiwan Strait issue, and on May 5th, Britain and Japan signed a Reciprocal Access Agreement, or RAA, to strengthen defense cooperation. After the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the CCP's stance of supporting Russia has offended some Central and Eastern European countries, and the 16+1 cooperation platform, namely cooperation between China and Central and Eastern European countries, has come to a standstill, and its tactics intended to divide Europe have failed to a certain extent. Since May, the Biden administration has initiated several high-level engagements with Asia, beginning with a special U.S.-ASEAN summit in mid-May, followed by visits to South Korea and Japan, where Biden attended the event of Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, in Japan. The Quad mechanism has been described by Beijing as an informal alliance without substance and merely a headline-grabbing idea. But the reality is that the Quad is now increasingly united and influential. This year's Quad talks led to the launch of the historic Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. Previously, the U.S. had little involvement in the economy of the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework fills this gap. Members in this region are enthusiastic about participating and will receive practical benefits such as the elimination of non-tariff barriers. Many U.S. companies, such as Apple, are looking to expand in the region as an alternative to China. IPEF places a high priority on improving supply chain resilience. Supply chain resilience can be understood as a synonym for supply chain reconfiguration, which in fact is trying to push China out of the supply chain. Polls show that countries in the Southeast Asian region are increasingly wary of the CCP's hegemonic ambitions and influence, and the IPEF provides a vehicle for a different vision that meets the expectations of Southeast Asian countries such as Singapore and Vietnam, which are increasingly seeking diversification. These countries have become reluctant to rely on China and are turning to Washington as a counterweight to the CCP. For example, the socialist country of Vietnam. Recently, Vietnam and India have also increased their defense cooperation. On June 8, 2022, the two countries inked a joint vision document to significantly enhance the scope and scale of their bilateral defense ties by 2030. This kind of cooperation very clearly excludes China. At this year's Quadrilateral Security Dialogue in Tokyo, there is a clear sense that the U.S. was trying to build a credible alliance that would confront the CCP if it tried to seize Taiwan by force. The U.S. won't expect India to contribute to a local war in Taiwan, but the least India could do is draw China's attention to the India-China border in the Himalayas. What took the CCP by surprise was the outcome of the South Korean election. Many South Koreans have suspected for years that Beijing has been deeply interfering in the Korean elections over the past decade. Now, unlike his predecessor's pro-communist attitude, South Korea's new president is prioritizing the Korea-U.S. alliance. In contrast to his predecessor's policy of engagement with North Korea, he has joined forces with Washington to focus on military deterrence against North Korea and to marginalize the role of the CCP in the Korean Peninsula. South Korea has announced that it has joined the U.S.-led Minerals Security Partnerships, or MSP, seeking to move away from the dependence on Beijing. Beijing has been worried about the idea of a U.S. Japan-South Korea security alliance, but what it fears is what is coming. Yoon Suk-yeol not only expressed his willingness to participate in Quad, but also attended the NATO leaders' summit for the first time. The NATO summit was held in Madrid, Spain from June 29th to 30th. In addition to the 30-member countries, the meeting invited leaders from Pacific countries such as Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Australia to participate. South Korea and Japan have never gotten along very well for historical reasons. However, Yoon Suk-yeol has expressed his willingness to put aside former grudges and cooperate with Japan for trilateral security coordination in the region. The South Korean president's office announced on June 22nd that it will open a new representative office for NATO in Brussels, Belgium. During the NATO summit, the first trilateral summit between Japan, the U.S., and South Korea was held, and a separate four-nation summit was held between Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. NATO was established in 1949 to confront the Soviet-led Eastern European Socialist Bloc during the Cold War.
This treaty is a simple document. The nations which sign it agree to abide by the peaceful principles of the United Nations.
In its new 10-year doctrine, NATO warns that China is a challenge to its members' security. It's the first time in more than a decade that NATO has revised its strategic vision, which is very unusual. It has to do with the war in Ukraine. In February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the CCP supported Russia behind the scenes and justified it by its opposition to NATO's expansion to the east. This move has brought NATO closer to the Asia-Pacific countries.
We now face an era of strategic competition. We see a deepening strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing. And China's growing assertiveness and its coercive policies have consequences for the security of allies and our partners. China is substantially building up its military forces, including nuclear weapons, bullying its neighbors and threatening Taiwan. Investing heavily in critical infrastructure, including in allied countries, monitoring and controlling its own citizens through advanced technology, and spreading Russian lies and disinformation. China is not our adversary, but we must be clear-eyed about the serious challenges it represents.
Among China's neighbors, the country with the most military deterrent is Japan. Japan has accelerated its military buildup in recent years and appears to be completing its largest military transformation in recent decades. It now ranks 5th in the world in overall military strength, according to the world's most authoritative ranking agency, Global Firepower. The Japanese government is expected to launch a new national security strategy in 2022, with plans to fundamentally strengthen its defense capabilities over the next 5 years. Recently, several Japanese politicians have proposed to revisit the 3 non-nuclear principles, which means not possessing nuclear weapons, not producing them, and not allowing them to be brought into Japan, and to raise the defense budget to 2% of GDP within 5 years. Japan has also purchased 147 fifth-generation F-35 warplanes. And in terms of its naval forces, its Maritime Self-Defense Force has an advantage over the Chinese Communist Navy in terms of destroyers and has an excellent submarine fleet. It can be said that Japan is one of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region that can really change the regional balance of military power. Compared to Japan and South Korea's strengthened relationship with NATO, Japan's enhanced self-defense capabilities are probably more of a deterrent. From Quad to NATO at its doorstep, Beijing is caught in an encirclement, and one can only imagine how unsettling it is for the CCP. All these facts are well known to the world. While conducting infiltration and interference in China, the U.S., the UK, and some other countries are smearing China with the new rumors, which exposes their deep-rooted Cold War mentality and ideological bias. NATO's so-called New Strategic Concept document disregards the facts, gives a false account of the true facts, wrongly defines China as posing a strategic challenge, and discredits China's foreign policy. It speaks ill of China's normal military development and national defense policy, is irresponsible, encourages confrontation, and is full of Cold War thinking and ideological prejudice. China is seriously concerned and firmly opposed to this. Over the past 3 decades, the CCP has used its economic and military might to coerce many countries around the globe, especially its neighbors, displaying an aggressive and belligerent image to the world. But in late May and early June this year, the outside world is surprised to see Beijing lower its posture and send its special envoy to Europe in an attempt to repair China-Europe relations. Wu Hongbo, the Chinese government's special representative for European affairs and former Undersecretary General of the UN, visited Belgium, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, France, Hungary, Germany, and Italy. Writing on CNBC, Frederick Kemp, president of the Atlantic Council, a U.S. think tank, recently wrote that Wu Hongbo sent a similar message at each stop. Wu conceded China had made mistakes from its handling of COVID-19 to its wolf warrior diplomacy to its economic mismanagement. Though Wu addressed Putin's war in Ukraine only indirectly, his message was designed to reassure Europeans that they are preferred partners as opposed to the United States. His bottom line: China will always be China, a country of growing significance and economic opportunities for Europe. Compared to the war wolf posture that prevailed among CCP diplomats in the past, it is quite unusual to see this CCP envoy admitting mistakes at every turn. Actually, it's not hard to understand that the Beijing regime now faces its most serious crisis in more than 3 decades. The zero-COVID policy, which has consumed much of the CCP's energy, tightened its finances and weakened its ability to continue its checkbook diplomacy as it did before COVID. With the 20th CCP Congress scheduled for this fall, all of the CCP's priorities lie in maintaining stability to ensure a smooth transition to Xi Jinping's 3rd term. With the CCP's top echelon divided and its infighting exceptionally intense, the CCP should not have much energy to develop a thoughtful strategy response in the run-up to the Congress. Communism is manifesting itself in an explicit form in countries like North Korea and China, and in a very discreet fashion in the West and around the world, quietly and gradually subverting the very foundations of these democracies. The fact that politicians are trying to contain China today doesn't mean that they have enough awareness of the dangers of communism. In the global game between great powers, there are often complex motives behind the actions of government leaders, including competition for economic and technological power, as well as national security considerations. With regard to understanding the essence of communism, the former Trump administration, as the leader of the Western Alliance, brought about a monumental cultural change in America. It is fair to say that the former president's efforts to counter the CCP, its proxies, and other communists have become a hallmark of his legacy over his 4 years in office. It is like the wheel of history. It has started and it's accelerating. Regardless of the wish of his successor or the CCP, the momentum has become unstoppable.